So not too long ago, I did a video in which I laid out a few of the reasons why black capitalism will never, ever, ever work. Ever. And as expected, the response to that video was overwhelmingly positive because, believe it or not, I know my audience and how much y'all dislike any wealth hoarder not named Karl Marx. Yeah, don't worry, y'all got a whole month to prepare yourself for that science, so get your booty holes ready. But that video was not without critique. And if I'm going to be honest, that critique was actually pretty good, if not a bit snarky. But I mean, finding genuinely constructive criticism on YouTube is like finding a debate streamer at an IRL protest. So you got to take what you're given is what I'm saying. Anyway, as someone who has held leadership roles in the past, one of my golden rules has usually been don't criticize what you don't have a solution for, which is why I never got into debate streaming. That being said, I have thought long and hard about what I'd do if I did rule the world besides mandate the wearing of sundresses year round. And after giving it some thought, firstly, I wouldn't start that big. And honestly, I think that's part of the problem. Instead of asking, how do we save the world? I think the more practical question to ask is, how can we address the issues that we see in our specific communities? And then go from there and then apply those solutions on a graduating scale. Because, I mean, that's literally how politics works, guys. You didn't think the feds just came up with their ideas out of thin air, did you? If so, then you're giving them way too much credit. Just like y'all do Karl Marx. So because I am a city boy at heart, and that's what shaped my perspective in my politics, instead of playing king for a day, I'm going to tell y'all what I would do if I were elected mayor of my hometown, which, for the record, is big enough that what I would do there could be graduated to larger locales, but not so big that it can't be a template for every town USA. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to ensure that everyone has food to eat, water to drink, a bed to sleep in, and someone to sleep with. Oh, wait, I forgot this isn't that part of YouTube, so let's just stick with the first three. This is why the name of this campaign is No One Hungry, No One Homeless. Has a nice catchy ring to it, doesn't it? See, I, for one, believe that public works should be just that, public, or at least as public as they can be in a society the scale of ours. The goal here isn't necessarily to make water free, because I don't know how you would do that, but to make it affordable enough that you don't have to sell a kidney to avoid a shutoff notice. And the solution, I think, is simple: rationing and peak usage charges. Now, I know most of y'all don't remember this, but back in ye olden days when TGIF was a TV block and a restaurant, we, and by we, I mean people like my sister, waited until nighttime to make non-essential phone calls. You know why? Because if you made a call or sent a text during peak hours, you got an upcharge on your phone bill the next month. And that's exactly what I would do with utilities like water and electricity. Everybody gets a predetermined rationing of water to use for their household for the day. After you meet the threshold, you get a slight little upcharge for how many liters over you go past the threshold. This will put the burden of costs on the wealthy, as they're more likely to use water for things other than bathing and drinking, like watering their lawn or washing their car, for example. It doesn't mean you can't use extra water,
but they gotta pay.
The extra money that rich folks would no doubt generate, because God knows nothing says excess like a wet t-shirt contest, would then be given back to the poorest in the community in the form of a subsidy on their water bill. Or at least a portion of it would, because, I mean, we still got to pay the waterworks employees, or else my cousins will literally murder me in my sleep. And the same model would be applied to electricity and heating. Logic being, the larger your home is, the more heat and electricity you're likely to use. And it's not like a lot of places aren't already doing similar things. Like, that's literally how it works for gas and lights now. And this is why we invest in renewable energy sources, specifically solar and hydroelectric power. Again, the city that I grew up in is right next to a river, so it works for us. We will slowly wean ourselves from non-sustainable energy sources until we can reach 100% self-sustainability. And yeah, folks, it's more than doable in our lifetimes. The last campaign I was on, that was our goal, to get to that mark by 2050. And this, folks, all gets to my main goal, which is for the community to get as close back to the earth as possible, which honestly, I think would be the hardest hurdle to overcome, because Lord knows some of y'all just don't know how to live without a skyscraper in view. This means an emphasis on communal gardening and low-scale livestock cultivation. And when I say low scale, I really mean like low scale, like little to no beef. Yes, I'm crying already. Trust me, urban farming is more than possible. One of the sites that I worked at in Philly was like a block away from 5th and Lehigh, and I distinctly remember hearing a cock crow and a Glock blow within like 5 minutes of each other. The goal is for us to become as self-sustainable as possible so that we can decrease the need and therefore scale of government. Additionally, we would seize abandoned property and either tear it down to create space for communal farms and gardens, or we would convert the building into housing, which, I mean, I know public housing does have certain negative connotations attached to it, but the honest to God goal of these homes is to get folks in and out as quickly as possible, instead of having 3 generations of in-home hairdressers and street hustlers living in the same unit for decades on end. Because believe it or not, research shows that housing first programs, first implemented in the 90s, have an 80% success rate in getting and keeping homeless people off the streets. What I'm saying is personal responsibility sounds good on a Daily Wire presentation, but the data says empathy actually gets you the results you want. See, my goal is for government to provide as few services as possible without privatization, because yuck. So then the need for taxation would be lower. And no, it's not an overnight fix by any means, but it is something we can do now within the confines of our society as it's currently structured. Oh, and obviously there would be no paid policing in my town because, I mean, duh, nigga. More than enough research tells us that putting more cops in largely black population centers does not lead to fewer homicides, but it does lead to more arrests for low-level crimes like, I don't know, vagrancy or shoplifting. You know, the kind of stuff that housing would prevent. My point is, more cops doesn't solve the problems that we're trying to rectify. Rather, what we would rely on is a network of self-armed volunteers who would patrol the neighborhood and respond to incidents. You know, like what the Panthers did before Reagan tried to take their guns away. These volunteers would be overseen by a community-elected oversight and advisory board, just to make sure niggas don't decide to go full Frank Castle for whatever reason. Because my hometown is divided into 4 wards, each neighborhood board within a ward would select from among themselves a community speaker who would meet once a month with other community speakers within the ward to discuss trends, issues, what works, what doesn't, you know, that kind of stuff. And it would stop right there. Because remember, we're trying to shrink government and decentralize as much as possible, depending on the community to do the things that government would do otherwise. And because the budget of pretty much any city with more than 100,000 people is like a third policing, that money would then be diverted to subsidizing all those public works initiatives I talked about earlier. Because again, we're not trying to raise taxes, we're trying to eliminate them eventually. So, yeah, this money would go a long way as far as alleviating the burden of all of those folks who are using extra water to fill up their jacuzzi tubs or whatever. Now we get to the part that I know a lot of y'all are really looking forward to, and that's what we would do about commercial businesses, because let's be real, we're beyond the point where most of us can imagine living in a world without them. So this is how I would structure mine. If the collective, or at least certain members of the collective, would create a democratically socialist business model, this would incentivize the workers to do all they can to ensure the business is successful, seeing as how they now have a vested interest in the company as opposed to working for a predetermined wage, which they can get anywhere. For those of y'all who don't understand what that means, it's basically a worker co-op where the laborers have a certain degree, something like between 30 and 50% ownership of the actual company, as well as the ability to determine how and who will manage them, if anybody. But this will require the business proprietor or proprietors to relinquish a significant portion of ownership and control to the workers. This will come in the form of a hybrid board of company directors made in part through appointments and the other through direct elections made by the workforce. And obviously the workers will also elect their own managers, that is, if they choose to have designated managers in the first place, because believe it or not, grown people can actually manage themselves when properly motivated. Again, if I know I can dick around as long as I want to and still get paid the same wage at the end of the day, so long as I make it look like I'm actually doing something, I'm probably going to do that. But if my take-home pay is directly correlated to how much or how little I'm willing to work for the good of the collective, then obviously I'm going to do that. And I mean, there's plenty of study out there that says positive, not punitive reinforcement is the most effective means of conditioning. Don't tell that to my parents, though. And it's not like anything I'm saying is unprecedented. You know that much ballyhooed Nordic model that made Bernie Bros bust a nut every time he mentioned it? Well, two of the biggest parts of it are high levels of workplace democracy and worker representation. In fact, by 2018, most of the EU nations had some law in place guaranteeing workers the right to elect some percentage of their company's board members. I bet most of my American audience didn't even know a corporation would accept such terms, right? Well, I mean, that's because this country is practically run by corporations in the first place, so of course we don't know that. I bet you also didn't know that in Europe, they don't run Super Bowl ads featuring vaguely middle-aged people performing day-to-day activities while telling you to ask your doctor about a made-up drug for a made-up disease you didn't realize you had until the smiling white woman convinced you that you would die the next time your left eye jumped. And that's because they have these little things over there called regulatory boards, but they also don't have football, like real football. So who's really living in dystopia, huh? We are. We're the ones in dystopia. In Scandinavia, corporations aren't allowed to just impose their will onto the workforce at will, like in the States. And a big part of that is because of the high density of trade unions in those countries. Also, there's a partnership between employers, employees, and the unions that represent them in order to create a model that is suitable for all and not just begrudgingly accepted by the worker because selling feet pics on OnlyFans is the only other option. The point I'm getting at is there's legitimate good faith cooperation between employer and employee as opposed to a perpetual game of fiscal limbo being played, where the employer tries to get the pole as low to the ground as possible before the workforce realizes they're probably better off collecting unemployment instead of breaking their backs in about 5 different places for minimum wage. So think of it like taking your company public, but instead of random rich a-holes buying and speculating on your company's value, it's honest to God day-to-day laborers who are given ownership as opposed to a static and arbitrary wage. So it's like stock options on steroids, basically. But that's the caveat, isn't it? You know why this system works in Scandinavia, or at least to varying degrees? Because they're conditioned to put the needs of the collective before the individual, something I've talked about in a gun control video that's no longer up because barely any of y'all watched it. This is due in at least a small part to the region's strong Lutheran tradition, with some scholars even referring to the Nordic model as secular Lutheranism. We're just not built like that in the States. Like, self-interest is literally the foundation of our society. Like, honest to God, we are the most hyper-individual society on the planet. And if you ask me, probably all of recorded human history. Truth be told, most of us don't mind poverty so long as it means that we, the individual, have even the slightest chance of being a part of the fiscal elite, which is why the same cities with the worst rates of homelessness are also the ones with the highest cost of living. And the fact that you can find like 3 abandoned properties on every block of every major U.S. city. We're just conditioned from birth to be as selfish as possible, even at the expense of the people closest to us at times. Believe me, I've spent over half my adult life in church leadership in some capacity. And for as much as people like to complain about giving 10% of their check to feed the poor, those same people will spend that whole check to watch Beyonce lip sync in a see-through sequence leotard for 3 hours. And honestly, I don't blame them at all. This model would require cooperation and selflessness. It means you have to care for your neighbor enough to at least be willing to sacrifice some conveniences, and just as important, trust them to do the same. It means that chances are you probably won't ever be rich because this system is just not built for that. But you'll at least live comfortably, and you'll never worry about having to be hungry or homeless. But is that an exchange that y'all are really willing to make? What this model means is downscaling to a tremendous scale. But again, is that what y'all really want? Well, if it is, then I mean, why not make it happen? Or if y'all do want to do the big picture thing, I mean, the electoral process is right there. Now, I know it's not perfect. I know that firsthand, but it's the best shot y'all got to make the kind of societal changes we spend hours on hours theorizing and debating on. If y'all don't learn anything else from me aside from a treasure trove of 90s wrestling references, let it be this: that all politics is local. Literally every major domestic legislation you could think of started at the local and then the state and then moved up, just like politicians who implement them. Like, where do y'all think they get the ideas in the first place? Talk radio and Reddit boards? I mean, if they're Republican, then yeah. But my point is, if you want to start a nationwide revolution, it starts on your own block. Identify folk in your community with the energy, the knowledge, and the integrity to take the interest of the community to the local legislator, whether that's a block captain, a ward leader, city council, school board, freeholder, you get the idea. Then rally around these people to get them into state offices, then the national offices. You see how this is going, right? As much as we bemoan the influence of super PACs and dark money donors, you know what made Bernie so formidable a few years ago for 2 campaigns in a row? Grassroots support. The people propelled Bernie to the national spotlight. And yeah, the result wasn't what we wanted. And a lot of that was by design, admittedly. But in 2016 and 2020, if they proved anything, is that there is still a place for populism in the states. Hell, that's literally what Trumpism is: a grassroots populist movement propelled by people pissed off enough at society that they did something about it. And it's wild how the right wing picked up all the lessons from left wing organizing efforts of the rights revolution era that we didn't, because we're still too busy going back and forth over whether debating is good praxis or not. What I'm saying is there is hope, but it's going to take work and it's going to take change. Specifically, a change in what we expect from society and what we believe society should expect from us as individuals. And yeah, I know this plan isn't perfect. Like, as I was writing it down, I saw a ton of holes that y'all are undoubtedly going to point out in the comments, but it's at least practical. Unlike expecting every POC in America to open a barber or braid shop tomorrow, which again, still would not make up for the wealth that we lost during the transatlantic slave trade. And since I know that's really what a lot of y'all want an answer to, it's reparations. Like, duh, nigga. Like, literally, that's the only way that could ever be done. And the only way that that could ever be done is forcefully. Now, let me preface this part of the video by saying that I by no means advocate for violence of any kind toward any human for any reason. I'm also not telling y'all to go do something illegal. I'm pretty much obligated by my designated FBI agent to tell y'all that. And yes, every black tuber you know has one. Mine's name is Jeffrey with a G. That being said, as St. Andrew pointed out in his guide to practical revolutions, the power of civil disobedience, specifically in the form of uncooperative action, has been grossly undervalued in favor of the perpetually impending big R revolution a lot of y'all are holding out hope for. But I'm the anti-intellectual for believing a Jewish man could perform miracles. Like, I mean, at least I'm willing to admit that my beliefs are absurd. Y'all, on the other hand. Anyway, as someone who has worked with and for unions in the past, I can tell y'all from firsthand experience that there's probably no more effective method of practical protest than a labor strike. Because, as St. Andrew said in his video, capitalism needs labor, not the other way around. The caveat is, how much are you willing to sacrifice, and for how long can you hold out until your demands are met? And the answer to that question really comes down to what kind of support system you have behind you, relieving the burden until the dam finally breaks in your favor. So y'all who have watched this video for a minute know how big an advocate I am for nonviolent resistance. And I almost always point to the Montgomery bus boycott as a prime example of such. But the thing that often gets lost in the mythology of not just that specific protest, but the civil rights movement, period, is that a lot of people were asked to make some pretty big sacrifices for a long period of time. But those sacrifices were never backbreaking because there was an entire community of folk willing to do the dirty work along with them. During the boycott, folks who could walk to work did that. And the ones who couldn't carpooled. And when there was no car to be pulled into, black taxi drivers offered to do the busing, many for no charge. And the ones that did charged a negligible fee. Like, could you imagine how devastating it would be if all, or at least a significant portion of POCs in industries in which we're overrepresented, like retail or health services or hospitality, or especially food manufacturing and processing, just got up, walked out and said, you know what? We're not coming back until y'all give us free. And just hear me out for a second. The rest of us who don't work in those industries supported their efforts with not just our money, but granting them drastically discounted, if not completely free goods and services that they can't afford anymore because, again, they walked out. And that, folks, is where the real revolutionary potential of black business comes into play. Remember right in the middle of the summer of Floyd that Blackout Tuesday was a thing? You know why that was never going to work? It's literally right there in the name. Maybe Blackout Summer, or more likely Blackout Year, or even years might have. But no, one day was never going to make a big enough dent in the economy for that to be anything more than an elaborate clout chase. So no, just buying black won't restore black wealth, but buying exclusively black for an extended period of time as a form of protest can force the powers that be to capitulate to demands of black folks if enough of us are willing to do this. What this means is you black business owners have to swallow your pride and stop feeling some type of way about your business being used as a means to a greater end. Because again, y'all ain't the answer to the problem we're trying to fix. It also means that black consumers have to stop being so quick to break strike every time a new Walmart rollback is advertised. It means we all have to be willing to pay a little extra to a business that just doesn't have the capacity to offer the same kinds of discounts as a big box retailer, at least for a period of time. But it also means that black business owners have to not use the opportunity to price gouge. Matter of fact, they should sweeten the pot with an extra chicken wing or two as a sign of solidarity. What I'm saying is there is an avenue for a black revolution that doesn't require a drop of blood to be spilled. But again, you got to ask yourself, am I willing to make the sacrifice to make the changes that I want to see? And that's really all the positivity I got for y'all. Next month, we back to violence. So, deuces.